Welcome to Name of Action, where we help you break down challenging passages in Shakespeare and bring them to life. Let's explore what is probably the playwright's most famous speech, Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, To Be or Not to Be. Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, is a conflicted soul, doomed to take upon himself the deadly task of avenging his father's murder. But what else do we know about him? By Act 3, we have come to see Hamlet as a thinker in his many moments of deliberation. This monologue, a soliloquy, is one of those moments. Keep in mind, a soliloquy is a speech in which a character speaks to himself, to the audience, or to others not present. They are a dramatic means of representing a character's thoughts, and therefore it seems appropriate that a thinker would have many such monologues. Arguably, as we shall see, Hamlet has a great deal to think about. He is also something of a philosopher. He contemplates how and why things are. Wrapped up in these thoughtful moments, Hamlet becomes a lover of words, and his skill with them reveals him to be an intelligent and sophisticated young man. Though given to fits of anger, Hamlet seems most in his element when he is melancholic. It is at these times that he confronts his greatest enemy, his own inability to take action. News of his father's death and his mother's quick remarriage sends Hamlet into a dark and somber mood. Resentful, he wants to leave Denmark. But when he discovers that his father was murdered, and by whom, his melancholy becomes manic, and he begins to lose his sanity. Or does he? Before we break down and examine the famous To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, we need to know how Hamlet arrived at this point in the play. Because this speech occurs at the beginning of Act 3, we need to know what happened in Acts 1 and 2. In Act 1, the ghost of Hamlet's father has been haunting the night watch at Elsinore, the king's castle in Denmark. The watch calls upon a nobleman, Horatio, to witness the haunting, and together they all agree that Hamlet needs to be informed of it. Meanwhile, Hamlet appears for the first time in the play. He is at court and is moody about his father's recent death, as well as his mother's abrupt marriage to his uncle, his father's brother, Claudius. Though unable to say anything more in public than that he's sad, in his first soliloquy, he discloses to the audience that it's his resentment of his mother's quick remarriage to his uncle that has increased his sorrow to the point that life itself has become repugnant to him. Late that evening, at the request of Horatio in the watch, Hamlet encounters his father's spirit, who takes him aside to speak with Hamlet alone. The ghost of Hamlet Sr. tells Hamlet that his soul is condemned to purgatory for not confessing and repenting his sins before his untimely death. He goes on to say that it was his brother Claudius, the current king of Denmark, who murdered him while he was sleeping in his orchard. This revelation sets in motion the tragic events to follow. For Hamlet is called to a revenge that pits the love for his father and his desire for justice against the life of his king and uncle. By the end of Act 1, Hamlet has sworn to avenge his father's death. The difficulties of such a course have him already scheming as to how he might accomplish it. In Act 2, the action rises, with Hamlet obsessing over the oath he's just sworn to the ghost of his father. Ophelia, Hamlet's love interest, describes this to her father Polonius. Whether his behavior is an act or is genuine, those around him now take Hamlet's earlier sadness for something far worse. Even if his offstage encounter with Ophelia was caused by genuine shock over the ghost's visitation, when we catch sight of Hamlet in Act 2, he's certainly feigning madness, causing Claudius and his mother Gertrude to wonder why he's acting so strangely. They assign Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, old friends of Hamlet's, to seek out answers to Hamlet's behavior. They find it difficult to ascertain whether Hamlet's depression is a result of his father's death or his abruptly stalled love affair with Ophelia. These factors may contribute to Hamlet's state of mind, though it's clear that it's his plan for vengeance that weighs most heavily on him. At this point, we have to ask why Hamlet is not doing something to accomplish his goal. What's the delay? Why all the acting and no action? At the end of Act 2, Hamlet refers to himself as a coward. Therefore, fear is a valid possibility. He condemns himself for unpacking his heart with words and devises to have a play staged in order to catch the conscience of Claudius. This will test Claudius's guilt or innocence. Ironically, Hamlet's first real action, the play, will also be packed with words. Is it possible he's angry with himself for letting his own conscience get in the way of taking vengeance sooner? This too is a valid possibility, which can be coupled with his fear or cowardice. And yet he has reason to listen to his conscience. While the Greeks taught that taking vengeance for a slain relative was a noble act, in Christian Denmark, the act of revenge was considered a mortal sin. Hamlet may be torn between these two conflicting philosophical views. And so, as Act 3 opens, the audience is left pondering questions not unlike those Hamlet ponders at the end of Act 2. Hamlet's procrastination and tendency to doubt and delay seem to be his major character flaws. He brings our attention to these flaws, and yet he persists in them. Does this make Hamlet an anti-hero? What is a true hero? One who takes immediate action, or one who thinks things through first? Regardless, his failure to act will cause much bloodshed before the play has ended. We must determine the meaning of the soliloquy itself, first breaking it up into 3 parts: the beginning, middle, and end. There's no indication of time or action passing between Hamlet's last appearance and this one. Hamlet merely steps onto the stage already deep in thought.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
Hamlet asks himself whether it's better to be alive or dead. Many interpret this as Hamlet contemplating suicide. This is certainly a valid conclusion. After all, Hamlet reveals his suicidal tendencies in Act 1, Scene 2, in which he says, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew," or that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. In other words, even before he has murder and vengeance to consider, Hamlet has wished that God had not made suicide a mortal sin. But let's read on to determine if he does mean suicide, or perhaps something else entirely.
Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them.
From these lines, can we prove that Hamlet is contemplating suicide? Perhaps there are 2 possibilities. Either Hamlet wants to commit suicide, or he wants to murder his uncle Claudius, an act which will almost certainly mean his own death. So, which is it? A contemplation of suicide, or the latter? Let's read on.
To die. To sleep. No more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache, and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished.
These lines seem to offer supporting evidence that Hamlet is contemplating death. But is it by suicide? Or does he believe that opposing his foe is a form of suicide in itself? Does Hamlet have a death wish, as some do after a dear loved one has died? Perhaps. He seems to be speaking philosophically as well. He uses the word we, not I, in this section of the speech. He seems to say in effect that all mankind desires an end to the heartache of life. Although it's possible that Hamlet is using the royal we in this instance, that's a device usually employed by kings and queens, not princes. The next few lines offer more detail on his thoughts of death.
To die. To sleep. To sleep. Perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life.
The thought of what awaits him after death makes Hamlet pause. He confirms that it's this fear of the afterlife that makes us choose life. Whether he commits suicide or kills Claudius, he fears he may find himself in the same predicament as his father in the afterlife. This consideration, called here respect, of what awaits us in the beyond, makes us endure the difficulties of long life.
For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, when he himself might his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death? The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of.
In the remainder of this middle section, Hamlet reasons that humans bear the burdens and labors of life only to avoid the unknown mysteries and terrors of the next world, the undiscovered country. Otherwise, he says, all of us would prefer to end our lives. However, his list of grievances seems odd for a member of the royal family. Most do not seem to pertain to him. For instance, the pangs of disprized love, which means the pain of rejected love, is a more appropriate phrase for Ophelia. He seems to have rejected her, not the other way around. The only burden he actually bears, fardel is another word for troublesome burden, is the delay of justice, and he himself is responsible for the delay of justice in avenging his father's murder. Regardless, Hamlet concludes that none of these numerous burdens, as dreadful as they are as horrible as the terror of what may lie beyond death.
Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action.
But what is his resolution? If he begins this soliloquy contemplating his own suicide, then the word conscience is problematic here. Conscience may mean contemplation. Literally, conscience means with thought. If so, then he's saying that thinking too much about death makes us afraid of it, and thus incapable of suicide. Is Hamlet the sort of person who believes that suicide is courageous, so that one refusing to take their own life is a coward? Is the intent to kill oneself a worthy resolution and an enterprise of great pith and moment? The phrase, lose the name of action, can mean two things. Either it means Hamlet is a coward for not committing suicide, or he's a coward for not avenging his father's death. We're now closer to knowing his mind, but is Hamlet accepting his cowardice, or is he challenging himself to rise to the occasion? Depending on our interpretation of the speech, Hamlet's objective with this soliloquy is either to find the courage to kill himself or find the courage to kill Claudius. If it's the former, then Hamlet has found himself paralyzed by the enormity of his fate, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and can't seem to either oppose it or effectively flee from it by suicide. If this is his objective, he's perhaps never a more pitiful character than at this moment. We can't root for one seeking the courage to kill himself. If he's seeking the courage to act on his oath, then this soliloquy seems to be both a consequence and continuation of his previous soliloquy at the end of Act 2. He's given himself a small reprieve from action when he plans the play. He feels he must discover whether or not his uncle is guilty. He may hope that the ghost is the devil's ruse, and Hamlet won't have to act after all. But if his uncle is indeed guilty, and if Hamlet succeeds in getting revenge, and thus ending injustice, it's unlikely that he can do so without great danger. Claudius is not just his uncle, but king. Hamlet faces death whether he fails or succeeds. This soliloquy marks a turning point in the play. Hamlet is poised to take action, either against himself or, as the play will ultimately reveal, against his uncle Claudius, causing the death of many others as well. Thank you for joining us at Name of Action, where we bring Shakespeare to life.